At 2 in the morning, when the world outside was wrapped in silence and shadows, Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He groaned, reaching for it with a sleepy hand, ready to silence the glow. Unknown number. At that hour, most men would have let it ring out, but Daniel wasn't most men. He was a single father who had learned that sometimes the unexpected calls, the cries in the night, the knocks at the door, could change everything. He hesitated, thumb hovering, then swiped. "Please don't hang up," came a trembling whisper, a girl's voice, fragile, scared. "I need help." Daniel sat up, suddenly awake. His little boy Tommy was asleep in the next room, clutching the stuffed bear his late mother had given him. Daniel glanced toward that door, protective instincts firing. He should have said wrong number. He should have ended the call. But something inside, that quiet compass fathers grow after years of listening to their children's unspoken needs, pushed him forward. "I'm listening," he said. The line went quiet except for shaky breathing. Then, softer still, "You came." Daniel didn't remember agreeing to anything, but before he could guess himself, he found his boots, slipped on his jacket, and knocked on his neighbor's door. Mrs. Klein, a kind widow who adored Tommy, shuffled out in her robe. She nodded when Daniel asked her to watch the boy, though her brows lifted at the lateness of the hour. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Daniel admitted, which was the truth. Minutes later, his truck rumbled down the empty streets. The address had come in a rushed whisper before the line cut out, and it led him to a part of town he rarely visited. High walls, wide gates, glowing lanterns. A mansion that seemed plucked from a dream, or perhaps a fairy tale. He pulled over, heart thudding. What was he doing here? A mechanic from the working side of town, standing before gates taller than any he'd ever seen, chasing after a wrong number. Still, he pressed the intercom. Static, then a fragile voice again. "You came." The gates creaked open. Daniel swallowed hard and stepped inside. The driveway curved like a silver ribbon, lanterns lighting his path. His boots crunched against gravel until the mansion's tall doors loomed above him. He pushed one open and stepped into a hall so vast it stole his breath. Marble floors gleamed, chandeliers hung heavy with crystals, portraits stared from gold frames. It was a world he did not belong in. And yet, on the sweeping staircase, slumped in silk, sat a girl who looked like she had been torn out of that world. Her nightgown shimmered faintly, but her hair was tangled, cheeks streaked with tears. When her eyes lifted to him, he froze. She looked at him as though he were the last light left in a storm. "I didn't mean to call you," she whispered, voice breaking. "But I'm glad you answered." Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't ask questions. Didn't pry into why a stranger in a mansion was trembling on her staircase at 2 in the morning. He simply shrugged off his jacket, draped it around her shoulders, and sat beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered her name. Alina. Her parents had died 6 months ago, a plane crash that had ripped her world apart. Since then, she had been surrounded by staff lawyers, and so-called friends who smiled at her fortune but left her hollow. Tonight the silence had been unbearable. Out of instinct, she had dialed her parents' old number, but in her trembling she had pressed a wrong digit. And somehow, impossibly, it had led to Daniel. "I didn't want to be alone," Elena confessed. Daniel understood, too well. His wife had died 3 years ago, cancer stealing her slowly, and he had spent too many nights staring at walls that would never echo her laughter again. He knew the silence that gnawed, the emptiness that crushed. So he stayed. He didn't fill the night with empty words. He sat quietly, letting her know she wasn't alone. Hours passed. The house shifted from darkness to dawn, the chandeliers catching the first pale light. When Daniel finally rose to leave, Alina looked at him with an expression so raw it made him pause. "Will you come back?" she asked. He should have said no. He had a son to raise, bills to pay, grease-stained hands that fixed cars, not crystal staircases. But something in her voice, the same plea he'd once heard in his son's when he begged him not to leave for work too long, stopped him. "We'll see," he murmured, and slipped out before she could read too much hope into it. But Alina did call again. Not at 2 in the morning, but in the quiet afternoons when grief pressed too heavy. At first Daniel answered out of guilt. Then, because Tommy, curious and kind, adored the princess lady, who sometimes visited the shop. She arrived in tailored clothes but left with grease on her sleeves, laughing when Tommy showed her how to hold a wrench. For the first time since her parents' crash, Alina laughed without guilt. For the first time since his wife's death, Daniel felt something stir that wasn't pain. But not everyone approved. Her family's trustees whispered about the mechanic who lingered too close. Her old circle sneered at photos of Alina holding Tommy's hand at the park. And Daniel, every night as he washed grease from his hands, wondered if he was enough for someone like her. He was a man who counted dollars, who boiled ramen when the paycheck stretched thin, who still wore his wedding ring because part of him couldn't let go. He began to pull away, convincing himself that she deserved someone from her world, not a widower from his. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One evening, after he turned from the mansion gates with a heart heavier than his boots, Elena came running after him barefoot, her voice cracking through the night. "Don't leave me too," she cried. "Everyone else has. Please, stay." Daniel froze. The walls he'd built inside cracked under the weight of her plea. He turned, and in her tear-streaked face, he saw not the heiress of a fortune, not the woman from a gilded world. He saw someone who was just as lost as he had once been, and in that moment, he knew it wasn't about wealth or status. It was about honesty, safety, and the fragile beginnings of love that asked for nothing but presence. The days that followed carried a rhythm Daniel never expected. What began as an accidental call at 2 in the morning grew into a thread that wove his quiet, practical life into Elena's fractured, glittering world. It wasn't instant magic. It wasn't a fairy tale where love bloomed in a single heartbeat. It was smaller, softer, the kind of connection built in shared silences, hesitant laughter, and the way grief recognized itself in another soul. Elena visited the garage more often, not with the grace of someone arriving from marble halls but with the eagerness of a child stepping into a new world. At first, she stood awkwardly by the door, silk dresses brushing against oil-stained floors. But soon she rolled up her sleeves, tied back her hair, and crouched beside Tommy as he showed her which bolts held a wheel in place. Daniel would glance up from under the hood of a car and see her laughing, her voice carrying a lightness he hadn't heard that first night. And in those moments, he saw not an heiress surrounded by gold and diamonds, but a woman who had been aching for something money couldn't buy: belonging. Still, whispers circled her. The trustees questioned her judgment, warning her of reputational damage. Her so-called friends mocked her for spending afternoons with a widowed mechanic and his boy instead of gracing charity galas. Elena brushed it off with a brave smile, but Daniel saw the cracks in her armor when the world wasn't looking. He wanted to protect her from it all. Yet late at night, as he sat in his modest kitchen, Daniel wondered if she'd be better off without him. He had little to give, a house that creaked, hands stained with grease, pockets that felt lighter each month. Love alone, he feared, might not be enough. One evening, when the weight of those doubts pressed too heavily, he told her so. They were sitting on the hood of his old truck, the sun dipping low behind the rooftops. Tommy had run inside for lemonade, leaving them in the quiet glow of dusk. "You deserve more than this," Daniel said, his voice rough. "Someone who can give you the life you were born into." Elena turned, eyes flashing with something fiercer than he expected. "Do you think diamonds kept me warm when I cried myself to sleep in that mansion? Do you think marble staircases held me when I felt like I was drowning?" Her voice trembled, but her gaze didn't waver. "What you give me, what Tommy gives me, is real. And that's worth more than every fortune locked away in a vault." Daniel swallowed hard, the truth of her words sinking deep, but the fears didn't vanish overnight. He had lived too long with loss to trust in happiness easily. Then came the night everything shifted. A storm rolled in, rain pounding against the garage roof. Elena had insisted on helping him finish a repair before morning, her laughter mingling with the thunder as she handed him tools. Tommy sat on a stool, watching them with the sleepy contentment of a boy who felt safe. When the lights flickered and went out, the three of them huddled together by lantern light. Elena's hair clung to her cheeks, her dress damp from the storm. But she was smiling, a soft, radiant smile that made the shadows feel less heavy. Tommy yawned, curling against her side, and whispered, "Can she stay, Dad?" The innocence of the question pierced Daniel's heart. Elena's eyes shimmered as she looked at him, and he saw the same plea she had voiced that night at the mansion gates: "Don't leave me too." He reached out, fingers brushing hers, and for the first time allowed himself to close the distance. Her hand was cold from the storm, but it fit perfectly in his. "Yes," Daniel said quietly, "she can stay." From that night on, the mansion was no longer a hollow echo of grief. Tommy's laughter filled its halls, toy cars skittering across marble floors. Elena's laughter, genuine and unguarded, rang through rooms that had once suffocated her with silence. And Daniel, though still a man of modest means, found himself belonging in a place he never thought he'd stand. It wasn't always easy. There were arguments, doubts, and the sharp sting of disapproving stares. But through it all, they discovered that love didn't have to be perfect to be powerful. It simply had to be chosen, day after day, even when the world whispered otherwise. A year later, on the anniversary of that first wrong call, Daniel and Elena sat together on the steps of the mansion. The night was still, lanterns flickering just as they had when he first arrived. Inside, Tommy slept peacefully, his bear tucked under one arm. Elena leaned against Daniel, her head on his shoulder. "Funny, isn't it?" she whispered, A smile tugging at her lips. A wrong number saved my life. Daniel pressed a kiss to her forehead, his voice steady and certain. It wasn't wrong. It was meant to be. And in that moment, under the quiet stars, the man who had once lived only for survival and the woman who had once been trapped in loneliness, realized they had built something neither expected. A family stitched together not by blood or fortune, but by the simple choice to show up when it mattered most, because sometimes the calls we're not supposed to take lead us exactly where we're meant to be. That night, for the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe in more than survival. He allowed himself to believe in tomorrow.